So this was the agricultural fairgrounds, and this was the cemetery. It's still there as Pioneer Cemetery Park, Southwest Ridge Park. It no longer has any active burials in it. It hasn't since 1860, about the time that this map was made. But this is, as you can see, this was a very sparsely populated area. When you get closer to downtown, you get some pretty heavy population going here, but further out past Vine Street, it's pretty much still the hinterlands at this point. So these are the two oldest houses in Vine that I have been able to document. I suspect there may be one or two that are older, but these are the ones that we know for sure are very old. You wouldn't expect this little one, this little blue one, actually dates from 1849. Is that better? Okay. Then it's still there. It's a 5-unit apartment building. It's doing fine in terms of its stability, and the interior hasn't been too carved up. This is the Justice Burdick House. This is the, I like to call it a mobile home, because it was moved twice. It was moved the first time in the 1850s. It used to face, where the Radisson is downtown, it used to face the Radisson across Michigan Avenue. Okay, Justice Burdick was the person in 1838 who was in charge of buying all the lumber to build the new county courthouse. And so he said, well, I'm going to get a really good deal. And he ordered extra wood from Papa to build himself a little mansion across the street. And he did. And then when that land was sold to build new buildings, then they moved the house around the corner to pretty much the site of the Comerica building today. And the reason they did that was in the 19th century, material was expensive and labor was cheap, so people moved houses. Okay? And so they moved it. And then in 1882, when they were going to build the wonderful Academy of Music that was designed in part by one of Louis Sullivan's partners, Dankmar and Adler, and it was an absolutely glorious building, again on the site of the Comerica building, it had to move again. And so the owner at that time, whose name was Peyton Rainey, said, you know, he said, well, take care of this, get this moved over the summer, and when I get back from my vacation in Charlevoix with my family at our cottage up there, I will take care of all the details that need to be taken care of. And he left. Went on the train and caught the stage up to Charlevoix and had a wonderful time. Well, in early July, when they actually started moving the house, they started moving it down Rose Street, and they got almost to the corner of Vine, and one of the property owners there said, "Thou shalt not cut my tree to let this behemoth house go by." And he was very insistent. They weren't going to cut it, they weren't going to trim it, the tree was going to stay exactly the way it was, and the house sat there in the middle of the road. Now keep in mind that even in the 1880s, Vine was still not that heavily traveled a neighborhood, so it wasn't that bad, but it was still really annoying and dangerous. And so they got a hold of Mr. Randy and said, you have to come home, you have to take care of this, this is not working out. He came home, but it took him a couple of days. This wasn't like he could just, you know, get in his car and drive for 5 hours and be here. And so when he got here, still the doctor who said, you can't do this, was still insisting that it wouldn't be done. And so the solution they came up with was to cut the house in half, which they did. And they moved it the rest of the way down the street and put it back together again. And if you ever get a chance to go in the house, and someday I'm going to get it on a historic homes tour, I promise. If you ever get a chance to go in the house, you can see the seam where they put it back together. They did it without damaging the walnut staircase horribly, and they just stuck it back together, and it's fine. And then they covered it with this awful Insul brick siding and the fake shutters. The porch they put on in 1882 is not bad, but I'd love to see something different on there. So that is, however, the oldest documented house in Kalamazoo. None of the oldest houses in Kalamazoo are actually on their original site. They've all been moved, okay? We know where they came from that we've documented so far. Most of them have been moved because people just did that. Okay, I'm not going to talk as much about the rest of the pictures. This is one of the biggest things, two of the biggest things that influenced the Vine neighborhood were this building the state insane asylum, the state hospital, and also Western Michigan University, at the time Western Normal College. Those were the two things that really, really made a difference for our neighborhood, because then we were surrounded by these places where people could go to work at a professional or even a non-professional level. So we had lots of people living in the Vine neighborhood that were attendants at the asylum, and we had a lot of people living in the neighborhood that were teachers at the university or at the college, and that were students, because there were no dormitories on campus until the 1930s. So people lived in the neighborhood. During the Civil War, this is one of my favorite people. One of the tenants at this house on West Dutton did all the research, and she found that Lieutenant Colonel Charles Edward Smith served in the Civil War very well from Kalamazoo. And when he came back, he built a wonderful house at 309 West Dutton, which is now, I believe, a 5-unit apartment. So it was a very substantial house. And according to the tenant, a lot of the detail inside is still in wonderful shape. So we had some people, I know there were many, many, many more people than this that served in the Civil War from Kalamazoo and from the Vine neighborhood. But this was one that I had a picture of. This is what the Vine neighborhood looked like in 1874 in a bird's eye map. Now, they didn't really float someone up in a balloon to sketch for hours and hours at a time. What they did was they did a survey of what the houses looked like from the ground, and then they just did their best that their imagination would let them to actually put together a map that made sense. This is the Union School, which, like I said, this was like the school for most of the city at that point in time, at least this half of the city. And right here, and this is between Westnedge. It's really pretty much in the empty space between Old Central and the Vine Elementary building. That was about where it was located, okay? And you can see here the street names are a little bit different. This street that we now know as Minor is called Burr Oak. The street that we now know as Village is called Potts. Axtell, Forest, those are pretty much the same. And then we have, this is West Street, because it did not become Westnedge till after the First World War. And Oak only went through to Vine. So that's why you don't see, and for a short time in there it was actually called Empire Street, where it makes that jog at Wheaton, it became Empire Street. So this is what the neighborhood looked like. This is where East Campus is now. And if you look at these houses along in here, look at that map, you kind of get a feel for it. I've got, the next one I've got, I'm pretty sure is the picture of, that was taken about 4 years later from the top of the East Campus hill. No, this is from the other side of the hill, okay? This is the hill that East Campus is on, okay? And right today, this would be Bellevue Place. No, actually, this is Bellevue here. It's a little bit further over. So this would be Asylum or Oakland Drive, I think. No, that's Davis. This is Asylum, going up this way. Anyway, they were figuring things out then, but I still haven't figured out, and Catherine, unless you know, why they shaved off the end of the hill. I mean, was it mining? Was it, I doubt it was mining. I can't imagine what we would have except to have sand and gravel as building materials for the city. It might have been the gravel pit, but it's always been a very dramatic picture. This is the Union School in the distance. This is a really great marker for the neighborhood for any photos that were taken during this time period, because until that school disappeared, you knew where you were immediately. The same way that today you can tell where you are based on the State Hospital water tower. Then it was that Union School because it was so tall and so distinctive. Okay, now this is the view I was thinking of. This is the view from Prospect Hill. This house is still there. This is Cedar Street, and this is Walnut. Okay, and you see what you have here is lots of open spaces, just like it showed on the bird's eye map, and almost like mini farms here, because some of these houses have little barn-type outbuildings. A lot of them have fences. Fences were more to keep out pigs and other wandering street animals than they were necessarily to keep things in. You'd want to keep your own animals in, but pigs helped keep the streets clean after the horses. Pigs will eat anything. So, and you can see how very different that hillside was. I mean, here, this is clearly grapevines, and this looks like stands of fruit trees of some kind. The hill wasn't really great for much of anything, but apparently there were some orchards on it for a while. So this was just a plain hilltop at this point in time. Now, one of the houses that I wanted them to talk about, this is Abraham DeVisser's house. This is still down there on Wheaton Avenue. It's Wheaton, that's still there. DeVisser was a celery grower, and this was about the time when celery growing really started taking off in Kalamazoo. A lot of the land was further out Portage. A lot of it was in Portage itself. What we think of now as Portage, but would have been Portage Township back then. And a lot of it was off the north side, but we did have some of it here in the heart of the neighborhood. Now, when they finally dredged out what we now think of as 3 ponds, or the crosstown ponds, that area used to be really prime celery land because it was boggy, but it flooded too much, so the city finally in the 20s decided they were going to take care of that, thank you, once and for all, and they dredged it out and took care of it for us. But this is not the DeVisser family. I wish I could say, oh, there they are, but this is just a picture of celery growers that were working in the fields. And the celery we grew was not what you see today, the Pascal celery. It was a white celery. It grew, and then it was very labor intensive, like growing rice. You had, as soon as the plants were big enough, you had to get boards on them, leaning up against them so that the stalks would blanch, and it was an ivory colored less strongly flavored celery than what we have today, and a highly prized delicacy all over the country. So, and we just had the perfect land to grow it, and then we had the Dutchmen who really like to be hard workers and were used to working in muck lands, and so they were able to take care of it. It's a relatively intensive crop, unlike wheat, which is pretty easy. Broadcast it, let it grow, go back a few months later and cut it and you're done, But celery is a lot more labor intensive with the weeding and with the blanching that has to be done, and then the harvesting has to be done in the morning when it's cool.